This video is created for educational purposes. I have researched and gathered as much information as I could find on documentaries, interviews, books, reports, websites, Justice for Magdalene's research, and anywhere else I could find it. I do not mean to insult or disrespect anyone I speak about here. So I would like to start with a word to the survivors. Ladies, you have my absolute admiration and respect. In researching for this case, I discovered just how little I factually knew about the Magdalene institutions, who was sent there, and what life was like behind those walls. What happened to you should never have occurred, and it needs to never happen again. I hope by pulling all this information together, having it here accessible in video and audio format, it may help towards keeping everything current, not allow it to be forgotten or buried, and therefore helping to ensure that it never happens again. So to speak about the Magdalene institutions, we also need to speak about the Irish people, the Irish state, and the Irish Catholic Church. The Magdalene institutions in the last century in Ireland were Catholic-run institutions with commercial laundries attached. But to fully understand the truth about this monstrous part of very modern Irish history, we need to start at the beginning. So let's do that. You're very welcome to A Drop in the Ocean, and let's dive in.
He said it's just a drop in the ocean. Why would anyone notice? What a strange thing to say, a ripple away from ulterior motives. Just a drop in the ocean. What a horrible notion, that I'm just a drip in the wave of your much harder day in your life with your way bigger problems.
The first Magdalene institution was established in England in 1758. The first one in Ireland was a Protestant-run asylum established in 1765. And we now know they also existed throughout Europe and in America and Australia. By the late 1800s, there were at least 41 in Ireland. The Magdalene asylums were initially privately owned, with their focus on rehabilitating prostitutes and unmarried mothers. In Ireland, these women were referred to as fallen women. It's a common misconception today that in Ireland, Magdalene institutions were solely for these so-called fallen women right up until their closure. But prior to 1922, each private owner requested that their Magdalene asylum be taken over by the Catholic Church. Following 1922, after the formation of the Free State, no new Magdalene asylums were built or opened, but the 10 existing Magdalene asylums continued to operate, the last one only closing its doors in 1996. At time of closure in 1996, there were still 44 women inside that institution, the youngest being in her 30s, the oldest being in her 70s. We have Magdalene Asylum survivors today, and we'll hear some of their first-hand accounts throughout this series. Following the foundation of the state, the Irish were known to have a very low rate of crime and a very small prison population, but this didn't account for all methods of detainment, coercive confinement, or punishment. By 1922, the Magdalene Laundries were in the complete control of the Catholic Church, operated by 4 religious orders: the Sisters of Mercy, the Sisters of Our Lady of Charity, the Sisters of Charity, and the Good Shepherd Sisters. The day-to-day running of the institutions was overseen by the nuns. I did contact all 4 orders to invite them to participate. The Good Shepherd Sisters responded. They did not wish to partake, but they did wish me well. I have not heard back from the other 3. These laundries were in fact commercial laundries, where laundry was contracted in for profit from hospitals, schools, hotels, the army, the navy, priests, private houses, many places. It was washed, dried, pressed, and there was also needlework carried out in the laundries, so workers were required. From this point on, girls and women, for a variety of reasons, some reasons still unknown to this day, which we will go through, were sent to the Magdalene institutions. It was explained in a very clear and concise way by O'Sullivan and O'Donnell in 2011 in a study they carried out on coercive confinement in Ireland following the foundation of the state, that these places were inherited networks of social control, referring in that regard to industrial and reformatory schools, workhouses, Magdalene Laundries and psychiatric hospitals. So these places were already up and running by 1922, but following the foundation of the Free State, they continued to operate as methods of controlling society. There's public confusion surrounding Magdalene institutions and mother and baby homes. They were run by the same people, but they are separate. Mother and baby homes took in pregnant girls and women. The Magdalene asylums did not. However, many girls and women would be sent straight to the Magdalene institutions from the mother and baby homes sometime following the birth of their child. The child would remain in the orphanage and then either be fostered, also known as boarded out at the time, be adopted, oftentimes overseas to England, America and other places, or be raised in the industrial school. If female, would often end up going straight into the Magdalene Laundries following or from the industrial schools. So all these places are very much intertwined. This series is dedicated solely to the Magdalene institutions, but I will also be covering mother and baby homes, the mass unmarked graves, the industrial and reformatory schools, and much more. Many women have never spoken about their time within the Magdalene institutions, out of shame, trauma, not to their families, not to anyone. However, some survivors tried hard for decades, trying to get heard, acknowledged and believed about abuse and mistreatment they suffered at the hands of the Catholic Church and in the hands of the state. Unfortunately, they were not being heard, not by church or state. The injustice of the Magdalene Laundries had gotten cultural representation, so there were documentaries made, books written, plays performed, but denied by church and state. Many survivors had emigrated on exiting the Magdalene institutions. They could not bear to stay in the country that had done this to them, and the stigma attached to someone who had spent time in a Magdalene institution was extreme. Their time spent in a Magdalene institution has had a long-lasting effect. Let's hear from some of the survivors now.
When I came over to England in 1969 on the 2nd of February, as I got into the customs, they said to me, "Have you got anything to declare?" I remember putting my case on a table, and I laughed and I said to him, "I'm lucky I've got myself." He laughed. I went off.
I found that in England I could be open and honest. We were so broken at this stage that we just didn't care, and all as we wanted to do, and me anyway, and a lot of the women I talked to, a lot of them went to England, nearly every one of them went to England, was just to get out of Ireland and get away from it all. It was tough. I was living in squats, I slept on the streets. We had no money. Got jobs, maybe one would last for a few weeks, another you might get it for 3 weeks. I even worked on a building site and put my hair up under a peak cap and let on I was a man. Wages was very small, rent was quite dear, we couldn't get a good job, we didn't have the education to get a good job. It wasn't easy, it was a very hard start, but at least in a squat you were better off. You could get up in the morning, you could walk down the street, you had your freedom.
Was England good to me? Yes, yes. I've had ups and downs, don't get me wrong. But I got an education, I did a degree, I was lucky, I married a good Englishman. My children were born in England, and they're not Catholic, and I'm very proud to say that.
I just couldn't settle down in Ireland, so I couldn't. Because everything was going through my head, and it's still going through my head. So it is, still to this time, it's going through me at nightmares and everything, with all the other tragedy that I had in life. I came back at one stage, I was pregnant, and my mother didn't want to know, so she didn't, Lord have mercy on her. No way. So I went back to England and we got married, myself and my husband that's passed away now. So I had 4 in England with me. And then when I came back to Ireland, I had another few. But I had a girl in between and things happened. She died before I was really due. And in England then I lost twins. They were nearly due too. There's days I get up at home and I'd cry and I'd cry.
England, for me, was my saviour. It was my freedom away from the Catholic Church, the nuns and the state. We had no chance here. We really were kind of very alienated from the Irish people.
Was always on the run. Security is not something that we know. Being loved is not something that we know. And I don't care. There are some people out there that are married and have kids and all of the rest. It doesn't work for everybody. It does not work. No matter how hard you try, it's something in there that was preventing you from being 100% totally honest and just breathing, because I haven't been breathing.
All I've wanted to do was do a job and be independent. But I have never wanted to marry or make a commitment to anybody, because I never wanted anybody to have power over me or chain me ever again.
In August 2003, the late Mary Raftery exposed the fact that in 1993 the nuns had received exhumation licence from the Department of Environment for 155 bodies. They had no death certificates for 80 women and no full names for 46 women.
Enjoyed writing, and I enjoyed particularly finding out about things. Kind of an insatiable curiosity. It's a perfect match made in heaven.
And we will speak a little more about this later. But from this came the formation of a group, Justice for Magdalene's group. This group was formed by 3 adoption rights activists: Mary Steed and Angela Murphy, who are daughters of women who were formerly incarcerated in Magdalene Laundries, and Claire McGettrick. And survivors slowly began to speak out about the truth of the Magdalene institutions. Justice for Magdalene's had 2 main objectives: to bring about an apology from the state and the establishment of a compensation scheme for all Magdalene Laundry survivors. In 2009, Justice for Magdalene's held meetings with the Department of Justice, Education and Health, a number of meetings with government and opposition TDs, where Professor Smith, who had also joined Justice for Magdalene's group, presented his archival research demonstrating state involvement with Magdalene Laundries, which resulted in the formation of a cross-party ad hoc committee by TDs and senators, coordinated by Tom Kitt and Michael Kennedy, who were both government TDs, and Kathleen Lynch TD, who at the time were dedicated to addressing the issue of redress for Magdalene survivors. So it was obvious to a lot of people here that this was a very real, urgent matter. Incarceration in a Magdalene Laundry had an indelible effect and really required immediate action. In April 2011, following years of meetings with government bodies, a submitted application to the Irish Human Rights Commission, an online petition with over 1,000 signatures presented to the Taoiseach, and much more, Justice for Magdalene's lodged a complaint to the United Nations Committee Against Torture. Because to date the state insisted they never had any involvement with Magdalene institutions, they were completely separate, as they were run by the Catholic Church with no state input, monetary or otherwise, and that the girls and women were there of their own free will and that they got paid for their labour. During this time, Dr. Maeve O'Rourke, who is now a lecturer and director of Human Rights Law Clinic at the Irish Centre for Human Rights, who had her sights set on working for the UN, thankfully redirected her focus and remained here in Ireland, and Maeve had also voluntarily joined the Justice for Magdalene's group in 2009, and in preparation for lodging a complaint to the United Nations, Maeve interviewed 4 women who had been incarcerated in different Magdalene laundries between the late 1950s and late 1960s. The women, whose testimonies were appended and anonymised to Justice for Magdalene's reports, gave evidence of An Garda Síochána, the Irish police, returning girls and women who escaped, and of washing laundry from state-regulated and state-funded industrial schools, among other laundry and needlework. These 4 ladies were unanimous in stating that they were not free to leave. They were forced to work constantly and for no pay, and were subjected to severe physical and psychological abuse and neglect. So just because the survivors had gotten out, that does not mean their suffering came to an abrupt end. They were understandably still suffering in a number of ways, regardless of how long they had been incarcerated for, or how long they had been quote-unquote free. Justice for Magdalene's found these sufferings as a result of their incarceration and continuing violations to include poverty, psychiatric illness, educational deficits, lack of access to records, and a deep sense of stigmatisation. Later that same month, in a meeting with the United Nations Committee Against Torture in Switzerland, when asked if the Irish state were going to investigate this, the Irish state's representative, the then Secretary-General of the Department of Foreign Affairs, Sean Aylward, specifically denied the facts presented by the Justice for Magdalene's research group.
Another issue which came up yesterday, Chairman, was in relation to the Magdalene Laundries. The Irish Government is aware that a number of women who spent periods in Magdalene Laundries feel they were victimised and ill-treated. I would like to stress that we have taken this issue seriously, and indeed I have personally met a deputation of women who had sad experiences to recount of their early childhood in these institutions. There is no doubt that they feel that the time they spent in the laundries had a scarring effect on their subsequent lives. The most serious allegations made by these women and the organisations representing them would, if proven, constitute criminal offences under Irish law. We have pointed this out to the groups representing these women. It has also been pointed out there is no statute of limitations applicable to criminal offences in our jurisdiction. They have been invited to make complaints to our police force, the Garda Síochána, if they are aware of details of any possible offences, so they can be fully investigated under our criminal law. However, to the best of my knowledge, to date they have not chosen to do this. These alleged events happened in most cases a considerable time ago in privately run institutions, and therefore the information available to us all is limited. However, as far as we can establish on the facts available, the vast majority of women who went to these institutions went there voluntarily, or if they were minors, with the consent of their parents or guardians. The only situation where any women were ordered to be detained in these institutions by law applies to one such institution in Dublin, which was used as a remand centre for 16 to 21 year old women pending trial. Periods of detention averaged only a matter of days in most cases, and as a designated remand centre it was subject to inspection by the state. We have found no evidence to date of any complaint by or mistreatment of women remanded there in that particular state mandated element. The Irish Government is considering, Chairman, how we can best resolve the issues raised by the women, conscious that many of the organisations which ran these private institutions and are the subject of the allegations are still in existence, mostly orders of nuns. The Government will be making a decision on this matter in a matter of weeks, but I can't anticipate that, and that's as much as I can give today.
However, now that someone outside of Ireland was involved, finally it was obvious that what the survivors were saying could not continue to be ignored.
My final point relates, of course, also to the Magdalenes. I thank you for the reply, and I'm very anxious to hear what decisions will be taken. As already mentioned, we have in several cases also asked for investigations into historical facts, and I think the whole idea about apologies, state apologies into historical events is perhaps an option in this case too. My question is whether there can be a public investigation of the institutions, given that so much documentation of possible ill treatment has come out. if there was any possibilities of opening records, for instance, to see if things have happened, that it doesn't have to, given so much information, that it shouldn't be dependent on 1 or 2 or 3 or 5 of these ladies coming up in a legal, asking for a legal procedure. My question would also be, are there any possibilities of, for instance, complaining collectively, to raise, to go to the court and complain collectively for those who are still alive? Are there any alternative civil procedure channels where they can seek redress and obtain redress even if they don't go to court? So some of those questions are still pending, but I do hope, given what you said in your introduction this afternoon, that this case will be dealt with in the best possible way. Thank you very much.
Now, I wanted to turn to this issue of the Magdalene Laundries. First of all, the head of the delegation told us yesterday that this all took place a long time ago. And I wanted to emphasize the fact that this committee has addressed such issues many times for a variety of reasons, not the least of which is that we are concerned about preventing recurrences. And the Convention calls for preventive measures. Article 10, educating and informing police and other personnel. Article 12, proceeding to an investigation. 13, encouraging and ensuring the individual's right to complain. And Article 14, as Madam Klepas said, making sure that the victim of an act of torture obtains redress. It doesn't say seeks redress, it says obtains redress. So for all those reasons, we're concerned about these people. They're alive, they have continuing effects, there are issues that matter. We have done this in the case of Japan, we have done this in the case of Algeria, we've done it in the case of Cyprus, in the case of schools in Canada. We've raised these issues before. So from our point of view, it's nothing new. On your response, you said that the vast majority of persons who were sent to the Magdalene Laundries, quote, went there voluntarily, or if they were minors, with the consent of their parents and guardians, unquote. Now, I really want to get to this question of what is voluntary. I think voluntary means that one makes a choice. I think that voluntary means that one is informed. I think that voluntary means that one is then free to leave. I think it means that there is nothing coercive in this context. And I'm like to ask you if you have any information to suggest that the vast majority of persons who went to these laundries were aware of the conditions, were aware of the procedure for withdrawing or leaving, if they made a choice, if they were given information by the laundries, or in the cases where the few cases where the individuals were actually sent there as an alternative sentence from the courts, again, did they receive relevant information in that instance? Now, as to the question, many of them were minors with the consent of their parents and guardians. What happened at the point when they reached a majority, when they became 18 or 21, if that was the age of majority? Was there a procedure in any fashion? Otherwise, we have a situation where it seems like there was not only a lack of question about consent, but also a situation where there may have been, appeared to have been, restraint on people's freedom of movement. We had testimony about locked doors and people being captured by the police and returned to the institution, so there's state involvement as well. There were physical barriers. And there seemed to have been an intent to confine people, and it seems that people who were confined feel that they were, as you indicated, harmed by it. So my question is also, what measures were taken? Can you give us any example of measures that we call due diligence, which you so clearly recognize in your laws on domestic violence, in the FGM bill, which says there cannot be an appeal or a claim of consent. You just spoke about that earlier, or elsewhere. Can you identify to us any example of efforts by the state authorities to inspect or regulate these facilities? Were they exempt from standards? And can you tell us what measures were taken to ensure that there were no acts or omissions that amount to torture? At the very beginning, in response to our question, Mr. Bruni and I asked about the definition and the use of the term act or omission. You said that an omission is a failure to take action by broadening the definition to include omissions so that a wider number of possible scenarios are covered. For example, the act of torture may also arise from an act of omission and not only a positive act. So this definition appears to include the willful failure to inspect a place or to regulate a place where acts of torture or cruel, inhuman treatment occur. Wouldn't this apply to the Magdalene Laundries? And do you foresee that as something that might be addressed in the coming weeks? You said that you can't anticipate when there'll be a decision, but it might be in a matter of weeks. So I'd appreciate any clarification on those matters you could provide us. Thank you.
The young girls and women that had been in the laundries, they felt that the state had neglected them. They had washed their hands of them, left them there not assessing the laundries to ensure the girls and women had proper care, that their human rights were being looked after, that they weren't being held against their will, that they were getting paid, that they were age appropriate and fit for the work being carried out, with huge heavy industrial machinery in steam-filled rooms where accidents did happen. Because again, this was a Catholic Church-run operation. It was not an issue for the state. And who also turned their backs and washed their hands of these ladies? The Irish people. You do not question the Irish Catholic Church. The Irish Constitution stated all citizens shall, as human persons, be held equal before the law. Until January the 5th, 1973, the Irish Constitution gave, quote, special position, unquote, to the Catholic Church. Over 92% of the Irish Free State were Catholic, so this was basically the state's religion. At a time of great poverty in Ireland and an almost bankrupt, newly formed Free State, the Catholic Church offered extensive infrastructure and stability. Therefore, their institutional presence was welcomed by the state in welfare, education and health. So there was a very close working relationship between the Church and the state, with little or no interference by the state into the Church's dealings. In reference to Ireland following the foundation of the Free State in 1922, this is straight from the Jesuit Centre for Faith and Justice website. And so, during the first 50 years of independence, both Church and state leaders, irrespective of political party, shared a desire to develop the country according to a philosophy of Catholic nationalism. As a result, the coming of power of Fianna Fáil under De Valera in 1932 was characterised by continuity in Church-state relations. A Catholic moral order. In the 1920s and 1930s, significant elements of the Catholic moral order were enshrined in law, particularly in the areas of sexual morality and family relations. Other forms of morality were largely ignored. Conservatism defined most aspects of Irish life between the 1920s and 1950s. For this reason, the censorship of films and publications, the abolition of the right to divorce by private members bill in 1925 and a constitutional prohibition in 1937, and a ban on the importation and sale of contraceptives were broadly favoured by all the Christian churches. A favourite theme of Irish conservatives and the ultra-Catholic lobby at this time was to contrast Ireland's moral character with that of godless Britain. However, this moral high ground was shattered by the findings of the Carrigan Report in 1931, showing sexual abuse, including against children, was rampant. It revealed an overriding desire to protect Ireland's reputation. As the Minister for Justice put it at the time, the obvious conclusion to be drawn is that the ordinary feelings of decency and the influence of religion have failed in this country, and that the only remedy is by way of police action. And so commenced a rapid snowball effect. As Magdalene institutions in the rest of the world were beginning to wind down, Ireland was on a moral high ground against godless Britain, but we were falling off of it. And so the grip got tighter and more strict, and the Magdalene institutions were instrumental in this, as the focus was on women and girls, largely dismissing the perpetrators. Moral Catholic Ireland were afraid of what the neighbours might say. Morality was the focus, it was a big issue, and it was policed. Sex outside of marriage in any capacity was the equivalent to murder, a mortal sin. The punishment was slave labour, incarceration in the Magdalene institutions, forced to work in the laundries with no pay. Priests and nuns could send people there simply because they believed they were in danger of becoming immoral, and you do not question the Catholic Church. The courts sent people there for many, many reasons, which we will have a look at. A random member of the public could report you and have you sent there by the priest, simply because you may be considered too pretty, gaining attention from men. Or you may be flirtatious, or have stayed out late one night, the presumption being you must be up to no good. But then, girls and women were being sent there from left, right and centre for all kinds of reasons. Nothing to do with morality. If you are too bold or have too much to say for yourself, that could get you sent there. Poverty, abandonment, deserted wives who could no longer afford to look after their children. The children could go to the industrial or reformatory schools, and the mother would go to the Magdalene institutions. Women were to be seen and not heard, and you do not tell. So victims of abuse, incest, neglect, rape, everything, and nothing at all. The worst thing could happen you in Ireland was that your family be shamed by any way. Prevention became key. Sure, she'll get a great education there, the priest or nuns would say to your father, while recommending that you be taken to the Magdalene institutions. And you would go. You do not question the Catholic Church. We were a very moral Ireland, to the point where the country is enslaving children and women in Magdalene institutions, and no one says anything. By the late 1960s, there were more girls and women in Magdalene Laundries than ever before. You do not question the Catholic Church. Unfortunately, shamefully and unforgivably, we didn't. Blasphemy remained an offence punishable by law up until 2018. In Ireland, this law held a lot of weight with the public, keeping them in check. If you went against the Church, you were going against the state. The Free State, who had been under British rule and were now free. If you did want to speak out, there was no one to go to. Who could you say it to? The Gardaí? The state? Your parish priest? We remained a suppressed nation, just in a different way, especially if you happened to be female. This whole thing remains today to be something that Irish people are still reluctant to speak about. Some Irish people. You will still hear today, their families put them there. But as we've heard from the survivors, those people leave out the part where their families were poverty-stricken and were told by the priest and nuns that they will get a great free education there. They leave out the fact that the courts sent people there, many people. They leave out the fact that they were sent straight from industrial and reformatory schools as young girls, from mother and baby homes, from psychiatric hospitals. They leave out that these girls and women were led to believe that they would never get out, that they would remain forever in the Magdalene institutions, just like the elderly women working around them. They will still tell you that this was women helping women, leaving out the locked doors, the high walls with locked gates, the prohibition on speaking, the forced labour. The survivors tell us of the constant beratement suffered by many of the women, or solitary confinement for 3 days in a cell with no food or water. The recreational time, which in fact was the second job without paid time, where iron sweaters were knitted or rosary beads made, among other things. They leave out the injustice, the inhumane conditions, which some of the women had to live in, sometimes for years. They leave out that these women were told they were nothing, they came from nothing and they never would be anything, and that no one wanted them. But I don't want to leave anything out. So let me be clear. Some institutions were more harsh than others, and there were some nice nuns, and what a beacon of light this must have been to the girls and women incarcerated, who often didn't even know why they were there. What a difference a smile would have made, or a kind word. Can you imagine? That does not make up for being held against their will, forced into slave labour, and some being trafficked from one institution to the next. Nothing can make up for that. But a smile and a kind word would have helped. And it would help if people would finally admit the extent of the injustice that happened in the Magdalene institutions. If an independent and thorough investigation into all allegations of torture and other cruel, inhuman, degrading treatment or punishment, and that the perpetrators be prosecuted, held accountable, that would help. And the United Nations Committee Against Torture agreed, because following the Irish state's denial at the Swiss meeting regarding the Magdalene Laundries, the United Nations Committee Against Torture recommended the State institute prompt, independent and thorough investigation, and also that they prosecute and punish the perpetrators, and ensure all victims obtain redress and have an enforceable right to compensation, including means for as full a rehabilitation as possible. Finally, the survivors were not only heard, they were believed. But this is not the end of the case of the Magdalene Laundries, unfortunately. There is a lot more to go through. Before we finish this first episode, we're going to hear from some more of the survivors. In the next episode, we're going to hear a lot more from the survivors and what their lives were like in the Magdalene institutions. And let me warn you, there are a lot of things that are not easy to hear. But the mission here is to prevent recurrence by keeping these cases current. I will also go through some case files in the next episode, which we have from the state, giving details on reasons girls and women were sent to the Magdalene institutions, lengths of time they were incarcerated for, and ages where available. And I will share some extracts from a book written by a Magdalene institution survivor. It's invaluable, and I really feel everyone should hear parts of it. And I will also go through the events that occurred following the United Nations Committee Against Torture recommendations to the state. Although we've only scratched the surface in this first episode, I know you can already tell that this needs to never be allowed to happen again. We need to keep this current, keep people informed to prevent recurrence. So let's learn from our past. If someone needs help, anyone, let's support them instead of handing them off to someone else, hoping that they will deal with the quote-unquote problem. So please help do that. If you are watching on YouTube, by giving this episode your support, click the like button and leave a comment. This is what will help other viewers to find the video. So let's keep it rolling, and go ahead and subscribe if you'd like to hear more. To get notified straight away when the next video is released, click the little bell that appears beside the subscribe button. If you're listening on audio, please follow and rate this episode. And regardless, please talk about this to your friends, your family, to everyone. Share a link on your own social media platforms. It doesn't cost anything, but it really helps, and it's very much needed and appreciated. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you in episode 2.
Okay, so tell us about how you actually ended up in a Magdalene Laundry.
When I left the Justice School in Mallow, my mother decided that she wanted to take me to England. And I went over, and I didn't get on with my stepfather. And my mother decided to get in touch with Sister in Mallow. And Sister that she would bring me back and put me into a training centre. Now, I didn't realise, Stephen, that I was going to be put into a Magdalene Laundries. I had never heard of them. And I was put on a plane back to Dublin Airport, and I was met by the guards. And I was put into a Garda car late at night, and I was driven to the Magdalene Laundries out in Hyde Park. I was met at the door by a nun, and she brought me into this room, and she sat me down and spoke to me, and she took my name from me. First of all, she said, "We don't know your name here now. Your name is going to be Monica. And we have to remove all your clothes, and you have to wear certain type of clothes here." And that was all sorted out, and that's what happened. And I was brought to a dormitory. It was about 12 o'clock at night. I was brought to a dormitory which was very big. There must have been about 70 people sleeping in the dormitory. And I was shown my bed, and I had to say some prayers. I was told to kneel down and say some prayers before I went to bed. Now, I was 16 years of age. And the next morning I was awoken at about 6:30, 7, and to the sound of everybody praying.
I never was educated, and that is the God's truth.
They would say that your education would have been working in the laundry.
No, how could it be? Where would that get you? That's not education to me. That's slavery. That's child slavery. And, you know, no doubt about it. No, I do respect the question you're asking. No doubt about it. The court put me in there not to work in the laundry. I got a sentence from the court to go in there because those days they never changed the paper around the paper that was signed for me as abandoned child on the street was for children that committed a crime. And I commit no crime to anybody. And I was put in that convent. And that's the God's truth. I was put in that convent. And I was a slave. I was. I was never, ever educated. I've got a great memory. I was never educated in there.
When I was 14, I was sent to a cousin to help on the farm. And he took me to a farm fair. And he had a lot to drink. And on the way home, he indecently assaulted me. And I told a cousin what happened. And the cousin reported the matter. They took away my clothes and they gave me this horrible, ugly, drab, I suppose it was uniform. They were shapeless and they were meant to make you as ugly as possibly could.
I thought maybe we'd do 6 months there and then be let out and that I would be allowed to go and see my baby. And when I went, first place they put me into the laundry. So I used to keep saying, when do you think I'll be going home? But when will I be going out? And one day, one girl said to me, once you come here, you won't be going out.
When I was young, I was thought to be pretty. Well, some of the girls thought I was quite pretty. I had quite nice hair. And I did ask Sister once why I was sent from the orphanage straight to the Magdalene Laundry. And this sister said to me, you're as pretty as a picture. And I hadn't heard what she said first, and I asked her to repeat it. And she repeated, you're as pretty as a picture, she said. And she said, the nuns sent you here because they were afraid you'd fall away. Falling away meant you'd get pregnant, and that would be another mouth for them to feed. So it was best for you to go to the Magdalene Laundry, stay there, which was dominated by nuns and priests, and they knew then that you wouldn't get into any trouble. So I was put to the Magdalene Laundry for that reason only.
Do you feel that you've missed out in life?
I do, yes.
How?
I think I would have, If I'd had the chances, the right chances, I could have done a lot better in life. Don't get me wrong, I've got 3 beautiful sons, which I adore. And I have done well in life, considering the start I had, you know. Sorry. So, I think they helped me a lot. They are my life. You know?
Do you think that the nuns held you back?
Oh, definitely. As I say, they made you feel worthless. Sorry. They made you feel that they were better than you were. No matter what. And nobody questioned it. As you know, as you said, did anybody come in? There was nobody to come in to see what was going on.
We were classed as nothing. We were told that we came from nothing, we never would be anything, and we would always go back to being nothing.
And when I went in there, they were changing my name to Benedict, Anastasia. I said, you're not changing my name. And everything I possessed, including the wee photograph I had of the boy that I first felt love for, care, that was taken from me, which me meant more anything in the world. And what frightened me most of all was that when I saw all these elderly folk there, elderly ladies, that I was going to end up like that, and the door was locked. And I would not eat for them, I wouldn't sleep for them. I just said to the Lord, let me die, let me die. I'm not staying here. I wouldn't want to stay there.
Why wouldn't you want to stay in a Magdalene Laundry?
I knew I was never going to get out of there.
He said it's just a drop in the ocean. Why would anyone notice? What a strange thing to say, a ripple away from ulterior motives. Just a drop in the ocean. What a horrible notion.